What's up, everybody? As has happened to me before, this is take two. Earlier today, I did an hour and 15-minute teaching only to discover that the camera or one of the hardware devices here that I'm using conked out midway through the whole thing. What a waste of time. And now I'm trying to get it right. And hopefully, having updated all the hardware that I use for this, updating their operating software here on my computer, I'm hoping not to have a similar calamity. Anyway, this is Steve, the tour guide, and this is part 2 of Isaiah chapter 17. Now, the reason why this is a two-part teaching is because the first part, we had to go back 10 chapters to Isaiah chapter 7 for the origins or the origin story of Isaiah chapter 17, which we found in a conspiracy between ancient Judah's neighbors, Syria and Israel. Israel also being called Ephraim. And if you recall, this is referring to the division into two kingdoms, two Jewish states, if you will, two Jewish nemesis states, if you will, following the reign of King Solomon. And we learn in Isaiah chapter 7 that Syria conspires with the northern of these two Jewish kingdoms, Israel, to take over the land and to place a king of their choosing instead of the sitting king at the time, Ahaz, the father of King Hezekiah. And in that chapter, Isaiah comes to tell Ahaz that God is aware of this conspiracy and he plans to act accordingly. And what he promises to do in Isaiah chapter 7 is to overthrow the kingdoms of Syria and Israel. Again, Israel called both in that chapter, Isaiah 7, and our present chapter, Isaiah 17, Ephraim. Okay, so that's important too. Israel and Ephraim are synonyms for that one northern kingdom of Israel. And it's going to be called by both those names. Okay, so we just want to keep that in order as well to avoid confusion. Now, we raised the issue in the last episode of dual fulfillment prophecies. And I had mentioned that Isaiah 17 is a dual fulfillment prophecy. A dual fulfillment prophecy is a prophecy that predicts both near-term future and far-term future events in the same passage. Okay, and in many ways, this reveals the divine authorship of the Bible. Okay, that a verse does have that dual fulfillment quality to it. Now, following that episode, several of you posted very thoughtful comments at the bottom of the video, and I just wanted to relate to a few of them because I think they contribute greatly to our understanding of these things. Okay, so the first comment I'm going to relate to was by a guy named Corey, who asked me, Steve, does Judaism recognize the concept of dual fulfillment or patterns matching multiple events? And are there examples from the Old Testament? And I answered Corey with the following answer. Great question. If you were to read the rabbinical literature, such as the Talmud, then I think you would see a lot of examples of their finding such dual applications. In Judaism, this methodology is called midrash. Matthew's methodology could be similarly referred to as midrashic. Now, what's this expression that I just said, or this term, midrash? Midrash refers to a type of ancient Jewish rabbinic interpretation and commentary on the Hebrew Bible, often used to explain the meaning, ethics, and implications of biblical text. The very term midrash comes from the classical Hebrew verb lidrosh, which means to inquire, to explore, to investigate. Now, as it pertains to this particular matter at hand, midrash is also often employed towards apologetic aims. What do I mean by apologetics? Well, I'm going to quote directly from a dictionary which defines apologetics, at least as it relates to the Bible, as reasoned arguments or writings in justification of something, typically a theory or religious doctrine. In Rabbinic Judaism, we see it used as a tool to justify or support a doctrine or practice that the ancient Jewish sages or rabbis considered worthy or important to observe. While in early Christianity, and let's not forget that all the writers of the Bible, save for Luke, okay, all of them except for Luke were Jews. And for example, the book of Matthew was not only written by a Jewish person, but it was written with a Jewish audience intended to read the book. Okay, so Matthew, who was a Jew writing to Jews, he also uses midrash, a very Jewish methodology, in order to argue on behalf of Jesus being the Messiah. Hence, Matthew's reference to verses like Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which I covered in last week's episode, as well as verses like the one in Jeremiah referring to Rachel weeping for her children that are no more, which originally was referring to the Babylonian exile of Rachel's children, those that survived their murder, okay, the murder of her children by that invading Babylon force. And Matthew's secondary use or believing that there's a secondary intent to that verse from Jeremiah in using it to describe or in the context of Herod's killing of the babies of Bethlehem who were 2 years or younger in his pursuit to kill the baby Jesus. So thank you, Corey, for that thoughtful question. Now, Corey's question began a thread of comments. Many of them, if not, I think all of them, were by a person calling him or herself by a much more difficult name than Corey. This person's name, and this is probably the only time I'll refer to them by their username, N1NJ4 Warrior. Okay, so this person offered a few examples of what they believe are dual fulfillment prophecies, and I thought these were exceptional, excellent, ones that I was familiar with but failed to mention by myself in last week's episode. So here he or she does, and the first one he or she offered was from the book of Daniel. Okay, saying, Steve, one dual fulfillment prophecy that comes to mind is Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, and Daniel 11 regarding the abomination of desolation. The near-term pattern was fulfilled by Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes, who, according to some scholars, becomes a model of the coming world leader, the future Antichrist. The results of that struggle, victory, and rededication of the temple being celebrated to this day as Hanukkah, see John 10, verses 22, regarding Jesus and his disciples being at the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and which took place in the wintertime. Okay, so that reference. Now, I'll add to his observation or her observation with one of my own here, which is several chapters of Daniel, which, if you recall in the last episode, I likened to basically the book of Revelation of the Old Testament. A couple of those chapters, which all of us, including myself, believe do have a relevance to the future, to the eschatological future. Much of those chapters were already fulfilled. I'm thinking particularly about the chapter that concerns itself with the war between what they call, or what the book calls, the king of the north versus the king of the south. Okay, the king of the north being the king of Seleucid, Syria, versus the king of the south, which was Ptolemaic Egypt. Both the Syrian kingdom and the Egyptian kingdom were Greek successor kingdoms to Alexander the Great. Okay, Alexander the Great dies. He doesn't leave his empire. He doesn't bequeath it to any of his friends or associates, and therefore they fight each other. Four of them in particular fight each other over who gets his empire, okay? And the two that concern us, because the land of Israel became the staging ground of the wars between two of the four associates of Alexander, or successors, those being the Syrian Greeks to the north and the Egyptian Greeks to the south, or Seleucids versus the Ptolemaics, okay? And they're the ones being strongly inferred here in that chapter of Daniel. Much of that chapter of Daniel has already happened, but we believe that parts of it or themes of it will be repeated again in eschatological or future times. Now to another double fulfillment prophecy that the same person mentions, and that's Matthew's use of the verse that refers to, and I believe this comes from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, the verse that refers to God saying, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Its original context referring to the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt, but Matthew, again, finding a secondary fulfillment or spiritual fulfillment in Jesus and Mary and Joseph having to flee to Egypt, after which they're commanded or instructed by God to come up out of Egypt after the death of Herod. And Matthew seeing in those events a reference to that same verse, "Out of Egypt I called my son," in this case, the son being Jesus, whereas in the original, the son being Israel in the collective. Again, a great example of a double fulfillment prophecy. Okay, this person then goes on to give a third example and even apologizes for it. No need to apologize. I loved this thread in the comment section. So, as it relates to the third proposal here, sorry, Steve, but here's another example. From Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, which both talk about the fall of Lucifer, the immediate context reveals the target as the king of Babylon per Isaiah 14 and the king of Tyre per Ezekiel 28, respectively, and would have had immediate contextual meaning with the figures at the time that Isaiah and Ezekiel were writing. Bingo, correct, excellent. Okay, here they continue. But as you keep reading, suddenly the writer's descriptions of those figures, those historical figures, moves the decimal point greatly. For example, you were the seal of perfection, or you were in Eden. Okay, this is Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 to 13. What, the king of Tyre was in Eden, this person says? The focus of the writers morphs to the power behind those earthly or physical kings, to Satan himself. Yes, another outstanding example of a dual fulfillment prophecy. So thank you again for those of you that leave thoughtful comments. These contribute greatly to the discussion we're having here. Okay, now I'll add one of my own that I thought of, and there's just so many of them, but this came immediate to mind even last week, but I failed to mention it, and that being Matthew chapter 17, verses 9 to 13, following the transfiguration. Okay, I'll read it to you, and you'll see the obvious dual fulfillment here. "And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them." Okay, remember, he took three of his disciples, Peter, John, and James, to the transfiguration, and he says to them, "Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." And the disciples asked him, "Then why did the scribes say that first Elijah must come?" Okay, because remember, Jesus' disciples were stumbled by this fact that he's telling them that he must die. Okay, first he's going to die and then be raised by the dead. They never heard this before about the Messiah, and they weren't expecting it. So they ask him in confusion and consternation, "Well, why did the scribes say first that Elijah must come?" And Jesus answers them, "Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. Okay, so here Jesus affirms the Jewish belief that Elijah really is coming. Okay, the real Elijah is going to return at the end of the age. Many of us believe that he'll be one of the two witnesses from the book of Revelation together with Moses. That's what I believe. Others of you may believe it's Enoch. Okay, but I'll skip that because that's not important to this discussion. Okay, but we do believe, okay, many of us, that Elijah is returning, and Jesus affirms that. But then he says, but I tell you also, really, that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Okay, so here another double fulfillment. Okay, yes, the Bible, and one of the verses somewhere in the Bible, okay, I'm speaking off the cuff here, so I forget exactly what verse it is, but something alludes to the return of Elijah. Okay, at the end of the age, he's an eschatological figure, and the Jews are correct and were correct in Jesus' day to be looking for him, but Jesus is saying, but to the extent that you can accept it, John the Baptist was a kind of Elijah until that ultimate fulfillment of the real Elijah happens at the end of the age. That's what's going on here. In another dual fulfillment verse or dual fulfillment prophecy, which again, as I said at the outset, is an amazing testimony to the divine authorship of the Bible, all this dual fulfillment stuff. Okay, let's now jump into today's study, Isaiah chapter 17, which I argued in the last episode and will continue to argue in this episode is largely been fulfilled, with the exception of this very first verse of the chapter. Here we go. Starting here with verse 1, an oracle concerning Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. Okay, now in a moment, I'm going to continue to read the chapter, but that is the singular verse in all of what I'm about to read for the most part until the end. Okay, in the end, there'll be some interesting verses as well. But here, a verse clearly has not been fulfilled. There is no time in the history of Damascus which, together with Jericho, competes for the title of the longest or most ancient continually inhabited cities. Now, Jericho claims to be as old as Damascus. The problem is, as we know from the book of Joshua, that Jericho was indeed destroyed and not inhabited for perhaps centuries until it was re-inhabited in Second Temple period times. Now, how do I know that Jericho was re-inhabited in Second Temple period times? Because it features in Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan, okay, as a city being resided primarily by priests in Jesus's day. So Jericho, though it may be as ancient as Damascus, has never, or cannot claim as Damascus, that it's never had interrupted settlement as Jericho has. Jericho's settlement was disrupted or interrupted by the events of the book of Joshua. But from everything we know, Damascus has never been destroyed, and certainly not irreversibly destroyed, as this passage in Isaiah chapter 17 teaches, which means we have a choice now. Either we have to believe that the Bible got it wrong, and that while the rest of this chapter was fulfilled sometime in the 8th century BC, well, it got it wrong, at least with this verse, because this city wasn't destroyed. Or as believers, therefore, we have to say, well, yes, most of this chapter was indeed fulfilled in the 8th century BC when Assyria destroyed both Syria and Ephraim/Israel. But the fact that this verse wasn't fulfilled doesn't mean the Bible got it wrong. What it means is that this is a delayed fulfillment, or at least this verse is a delayed fulfillment as part of a dual fulfillment prophecy. Okay, so again, I'm just going to read this verse again because it's the verse here in question. An oracle concerning Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. Okay, but here we're going to pick up from verse 2, and we're going to see that much of this from verse 2 onward was already fulfilled. The cities of Aroer are deserted. They will be for flocks, which will lie down, and none will make them afraid. Verse 3, the fortress will disappear from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus. And the remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. And in that day, the glory of Jacob will be brought low, and the fat of his flesh will grow lean. And it shall be as when the reaper gathers standing grain, and his arm harvests the ears, and as when one gleans the ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Gleanings will be left in it. As when an olive tree is beaten, 2 or 3 berries in the top of the highest bough, 4 or 5 on the branches of a fruit tree, declares the Lord God of Israel. Now, concerning the above, most of this was fulfilled within decades of the proclamation of Isaiah chapter 7. This destruction of Syria, this destruction of Israel / Ephraim, the thinning out of their populations, the likening of this to the agricultural phenomena, the one that's most beautifully depicted here, the harvest of olives. And maybe some of you have seen the way olives are harvested. If you've been with me on a tour to Israel in the months of September and October when that harvest takes place, to this day, it's the exact same methodology in which the harvesters come with massive sticks and they beat the tree, they beat the branches of the tree. It's a violent process in which most of the olives and many of the twigs of the olive tree fall to the ground, and all that's left after this process is a few berries left in the tree. That's it, after a violent process. A phenomenal depiction or dramatization or allegory of what occurred in the 8th century BC when Assyria destroyed both Syria and Israel / Ephraim. All of this was proclaimed by Isaiah in chapter 7, and I just want to revisit the relevant passages there, okay, to connect the dots and to make this easier or more easily understood. So, picking it up again in verse 1 of Isaiah 7, okay, which we covered last week, speaking of that conspiracy between Syria and Israel, Judah's neighbor to the north. In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. So, the very first verses of Isaiah 7 refer to the original sin of Syria and Ephraim that leads to that destruction of Isaiah 17. That original sin being a conspiracy to take over Judah to a degree, or at least to take over it to the extent that they depose Ahaz and place a king. They want to place a king of their own choosing instead of Ahaz on the throne that will do their bidding and pursue their policies, if not outright them take over the land of Judah. And Isaiah is sent by God to proclaim this very stark warning. It's not even a warning, it's really a prediction. It's written in stone and it's unalterable, that Isaiah proclaims to Ahaz concerning this conspiracy of Syria together with Israel. Isaiah says, "It shall not stand, it shall not come to pass, for the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, its king. And within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. Okay, we just saw this played out dramatically in Isaiah 17. Okay, the whole thing with the olive tree. Okay, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is its king, the son of Remaliah. If you're not firm in faith, Ahaz, you will not be firm at all. So here Isaiah is predicting the total overthrow of Syria and its capital, and Israel/Ephraim and its capital, which is Samaria, to take place only 65 years from Isaiah's proclamation. And thus we see the near-term future being prophesied by both Isaiah 7 and Isaiah 17. The problem is, again, when we return to the very first verse of Isaiah 17 to see how Isaiah's proclamation was carried through, we immediately run into the problem of Isaiah 17 verse 1 concerning Damascus, because Damascus has never been destroyed per the prediction of Isaiah 17 verse 1, which means that Isaiah 17 is a dual fulfillment prophecy. That's the only conclusion we can arrive to. Otherwise, the only other conclusion is that the Bible got it wrong and erred in its prediction, okay? Because Damascus wasn't destroyed per that verse, okay? So as believers, we have to choose the only other option, which is that this is a dual fulfillment prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled at some future date. Now that leaves us with the question, Steve, when will that be fulfilled? Do you agree with many of the people in the prophecy world, okay, that Isaiah 17 is a war separate unto itself, separate from Armageddon, separate from Gog and Magog, separate from Joel chapter 3, separate from Zechariah chapters 12 through 14, all of which I've argued are referring to a singular war at the end of the age, only in that each of them differ in what that singular war is called. To the one, Gog and Magog; to the other, Armageddon; to the other two, it's simply called the day of the Lord or the day of Yahweh. Or do you, Steve, agree with these other people that this is a war separate unto itself and it's just around the corner and may happen in the next few months, the next couple years? Well, at the risk of looking or sounding intellectually lazy, I'm going to say that I actually think that this is likely referring to that final war at the end of the age. Isaiah, or this portion of Isaiah, is his own angle, as opposed to Ezekiel's angle, as opposed to Joel's angle, as opposed to Zechariah's take on the same war. Now, what do I base that on? Am I really just being intellectually lazy here and by default retreating to that safe space that I've argued every single episode of this series, making sense of the end times? No, it's not any intellectual laziness on my part. I'm going to base that prediction on the final verses of Isaiah chapter 17, beginning with verse 7. In that day, man will look to his maker. Okay, so in that day, man, or you could say humankind here, this is universal. This is not just the Jews looking to their maker. This isn't just the Syrians looking to their maker. But in the day of Isaiah 17, the war and its aftermath will cause man, or all of humankind, to look to his maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. And I've argued, of course, in all the preceding episodes that that's what all this end time stuff is all about, to get the eyes of both the Jew and the Gentile on the God of Israel, Yahweh, to recognize that he indeed is God and the God of history. He's the one behind the momentum of history. He's trying to get our attention here. Okay, and he says here that this war does exactly that. And the eyes of mankind basically will look on the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars, the work of his hands, and he will not look on what his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. Now, the reference here to the Asherim is referring to these fertility cult related poles, okay, that the Israelites inherited or took over from the Canaanites. In other words, these backslidden Israelites continued to worship after the manner of the Canaanites here. Okay, so here it is, at least in that verse, being particularized to the Israelites. But again, going back to a larger audience here, in that day there, who's there? Okay, in that day, their strong cities will be like the deserted places of the wooded heights and the hilltops, which they deserted because of the children of Israel. And there will be desolation. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Now, you could argue, Steve, that has to be referring to the Jews. Okay, I mean, God is their God. He is their rock and he is their salvation. And of course, I would say, yeah, that's all true. But you could also say that for the last 2,000 years, since the advent of Christianity, he's also been the rock of large portions of the world calling itself the Christian world, who themselves are backslidden. I don't think any of you would disagree with me that the Western world has retreated from its Christian faith. Okay, and many of us could argue that the Western world has retreated back to its pre-Christian paganism to a great degree, or to secular humanism. Much of the Western world, or what used to be the Christian world, they're not looking either at the God of their salvation or the rock of their refuge. Okay, so you can't argue entirely that this is exclusive to the Jews. You could say that this too is speaking to the Jews and non-Jews of the last 2,000 years who've reneged on their Christianity, okay? Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants and sow the vine branch of a stranger, though you make them grow on the day that you plant them and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. Ah, the thunder of many peoples. Okay, at least that's returning to the theme of universality here. Okay, it's undisputed here. Ah, the thunder of many peoples. They thunder like the thunder of the sea. Ah, the roar of the nations. They roar like the roaring of mighty waters. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away, chased like chaff on the mountains before the wind, and whirling dust before the storm. At evening time, behold, terror. Before morning, they are no more. This is the portion of those who loot us, and the lot of those who plunder us. So, in the last several verses that I read, to me, it's clear we're seeing a repeat of a theme taken up by many of the previous chapters that I've covered in the series, and that is this cosmic nature of this war, this universal aspect to this war. It seems as you read through these verses, among others in other chapters, that this war is not confined to the locality of Israel and Syria, that this is not parochial in scope. Rather, this is universal in scope. This is encompassing many nations, okay? And whereas Ezekiel and Joel and Zechariah refer to many of Israel's neighbors not existing beyond this war, okay, totally disappearing in the aftermath of this war, not continuing into the age to come, okay, what you and I would call the millennium. Here, Isaiah is focusing on one of those neighbors, in particular, that neighbor being Syria and its capital, Damascus. And therefore, I would argue that Isaiah 17 is just another take on that final cosmic apocalyptic war at the end of the age preceding the return of Jesus. That's my take, and therefore it's consistent with what I've argued throughout the series. And let me know what your take is in the comments section below. And perhaps with some thoughtful, phenomenal comments, as was the case in the last video, it will lead into a good discussion in the beginning of the next video of this series, Making Sense of the End Times. If you want to treat Steve the tour guide to a cup of coffee, you can do so by visiting my Ko-fi page, which I link in the extended description below each and every video. And I want to thank those of you who have been extremely generous over the last couple months in this dry season, unfortunately, because of war-related unemployment in Israel. I hope that war comes to an end, and I hope I can go back to work and work in my chosen profession. But until then, you're helping me with cups of coffee, which have brought me tremendous pleasure. And again, I want to thank you. This is Steve, the tour guide, wishing you a phenomenal weekend. Take in some great weather. I hope where you are that you're enjoying some great spring weather. I know I am. Unfortunately, the spring season becomes all the more abbreviated, it seems, each year, as those dog days of July and August, my least favorite months of the year, always seem to be quickly coming up behind these great days that I'm enjoying now. So before it gets super humid and super hot, I plan to enjoy some crisp, low humidity days on my bicycle, getting in some mileage and hopefully losing about 15 pounds that I gained over the winter owing to an Achilles tendon injury. I'm primarily a runner who also cycles, and unfortunately, I haven't been able to run in about 7 months owing to a really bad case of Achilles tendonitis in my right foot, which still hasn't healed, but at least with this good weather, I'm able to jump on a bike and hopefully start to put a dent in the 15 pounds that I gained while on injury reserve. This is Steve the tour guide signing off. Until next week, bye-bye.